Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Everqueen in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. 29. The medical deck of the Epona was a large but sterile and austere space, a far cry from the ornate decorations on the rest of the ship. The walls and floors were pristine white, with rows of beds also furnished in white, and stainless steel cabinets and trolleys containing all the machines and tools the Emperor's doctors could require. There were also a few private rooms attached to the medical deck, and it was in one of these that Isha was examining the currently slumbering Horus, laid upon a large bed, the Emperor looming on the other side as he waited for Isha to finish her scans, and to strike her down if she dared to harm the boy. Fortunately, Isha had no intention of doing anything of that, and she made an effort to telegraph what she was doing, so the Emperor could see every last drop of her power and exactly what she was doing with it. The child was an amazing example of gene forging, Isha had to admit. His genetic sequence was absolutely perfect, not a single gene out of place. His brain was superbly crafted, an organic machine that could process and store information on a scale impossible for mortals. His body could endure and recover from damage in ways that no mortal, whether human or Eldar, could. Horus was young, but within him lay the potential to rival the mightiest demigods of ages past, to wield enough power to slay the greatest of daemons and perhaps even battle the shards of the Ingur. But it was not his physical shell that truly amazed Isha, but the spirit that lay within it. Isha had known from the moment that she had sensed Horus that the Emperor's sons, the Primarchs, were no mere demigods. Their souls blazed with such power and had been sculpted in such a manner that there was no mistaking the fact that they were the result of god forging. The boy was not an actual god, of course. His power was but the palest shadow of her own, and even further from the Emperor's. He had no domain, no worshippers. He didn't even really know what powers he had. But he had been created through god forging nevertheless. Isha could see the techniques of the old ones in the very shape of his soul. She had seen them on Gorka Morka, on the Canib Overmind, on the various gods that had died during the war in heaven. On her own family, albeit to a lesser extent than the others, since they had existed even before the old ones had taken them and reforged them as weapons. Isha had used those techniques herself, with Kernus's aid, to create Liliath. The boy's soul reminded her of how her daughter had been back then, if far less powerful. The same shining innocence and clarity of children, filled with impossible power and potential. But that was not what mattered here. The question was, how had the Emperor learned god forging? Isha had suspicions of where the Emperor had come from, and this lent credence to them, but to think he was not only a result of god forging, but capable of doing so himself. It raised even more questions than before. Isha had remained silent and not attempted to broach the Emperor on the subject of his birth before, but now, the curiosity was almost overwhelming. Though perhaps after she had finished examining Horus. The Emperor seemed even more tense than usual. The Emperor watched as Isha scanned Horus, strangling the urge to pull the boy away. After they had boarded the shuttle once more, the Emperor had immediately touched Horus's mind, gently pushing the boy to fall asleep. Once they had returned to the Epona proper, he had taken his son to the medical deck, and immediately conducted an extensive scan of his mind, body, and soul, searching for any trace of chaos. He had found nothing, but his paranoia was not so easily sated. After that, he had commanded Isha to work on it. Still, even though it was for the best, and he doubted Isha would actually do anything, it set the Emperor on edge to watch an alien warp construct examine his son's mind, body, and soul, even with as light a touch as Isha was using, clearly aware of his mood. At last, Isha pulled back, the green light fading from both her eyes and Horus's body. "He is absolutely fine, Your Majesty," Isha affirmed. "Chaos has not left a single mark on him." The Emperor exhaled, feeling unusually relieved, before immediately feeling slightly embarrassed at having done so. Usually, his psychic aura covered any of his weaker moments or reactions, but Isha was perhaps the only person who could see right through it. Even Malkador could not do so unless the Emperor suppressed most of his power. Powerful blanks could, but ones strong enough to do so were not common. But Isha was capable of seeing straight through his aura, and though the Emperor would never admit it, it made him uncomfortable. It had been the better part of 10,000 years since he had bothered to suppress his aura to any significant degree unless it was in private with the closest of his companions, most of whom were dead now. Even to those he had wished to present a humbler or more ascetic image of himself, it was a matter of modulating his aura rather than suppressing it. It had become a shield of sorts, allowing him to veil his true self from those he did not wish to see it. The fact that an Eldar warp construct was able to see through it with absolutely no effort still disconcerted him on some level. "That is good to know," he said in response to Isha's report. "I am glad he is unharmed." The Emperor waited for a moment, suspecting Isha clearly had other questions. There was no way her examination of Horus had not sparked her curiosity. He was not disappointed. "You created your sons through God forging?" Isha said, clearly bursting with questions. The Emperor nodded reluctantly. He did not wish to admit it, but there was no point in pretending otherwise. "I did, though I prefer to think of it as soul forging instead. My sons are not gods." Isha arched an eyebrow, but did not press him on his choice of phrasing. "How in the world did you do it?" she asked, her voice brimming with curiosity. Even in this limited manner, performing soul forging with the current state of the immaterium should be impossible. Chaos would notice and interfere immediately. She paused, a look of realization crossing her face, unless they were distracted. The Emperor had hoped a little that she wouldn't pick up on that, but it wasn't exactly difficult to deduce that he had created the seeds that would become the souls of the Primarchs while Chaos had devoted most of its attention to overwhelming the Eldar pantheon as the Age of Strife raged. Still, Isha continued. "Even with Chaos largely distracted, you would need a reasonably safe place in the Ether to perform the ritual. Soul forging is not an easily concealed process." "How?" "That information is not relevant to our agreement," the Emperor said evasively, trying to quell his annoyance at how much she had deduced from so little. "I see no reason to share it with you." "I realize that, but I would still like to know." Isha pressed. "To find a place within the immaterium hidden from the gaze of Chaos, where you could create your children without disturbance, it's an extraordinary feat." "How did you do it?" "As I said before, that is not relevant to our agreement," the Emperor said, irritation rising. "You have no need to know of it, and in any case, it is not a method that would work again, with Chaos no longer distracted." He reluctantly added, hoping it would make her back off. Isha frowned, clearly annoyed by his refusal to answer but realizing there was nothing she could do to convince him. "Very well," she said, crossing her arms. "But I have a different question. Would you be willing to answer it?" "That depends on what the question is," the Emperor said, wondering what she wanted to know now. "How were you created?" Isha asked, her gaze sharpening. "Or rather, who created you? It was an old one, was it not? Or a fragment of one, at least. It took an interest in your people when they were young, and decided to create you for some purpose, most likely to fight Chaos. And you likely inherited the knowledge of God, soul forging from your creator." The Emperor stiffened abruptly at her question. For a long moment, there was silence before the Emperor finally spoke. "Well, you appear to have deduced everything quite easily, so I don't understand why you are asking me what you already know," he said, an edge creeping into his voice. Isha's eyes widened, as she seemed to realize she might have misstepped. "I was merely hoping for some confirmation," she said carefully. "And I wished to know whether or not you were created to fight Chaos. Then you have your confirmation," the Emperor said tersely. "And yes, I was created to fight Chaos, if that is what you wished to know. By some of his creators, at least." "I see," Isha said, clearly having recognized she had broached a deeply sensitive matter, but unsure of what exactly the issue was. Not that the Emperor felt any desire to clarify them for her. The circumstances and beings involved in his creation had always been a deeply complicated matter for him, and he had never explained the full details to anyone. Even his closest confidants and allies had only been given a basic summary. The Emperor certainly wasn't going to have a heart-to-heart about it with an Eldar warp construct. For several moments, there was an uncomfortable silence, before Isha bowed. "My apologies for overstepping, Your Majesty," she said awkwardly. "I will return to my chambers, if there is nothing else you require of me." The Emperor nodded curtly, turning his attention back to Horus as Isha backed away. The Emperor ignored her as she left, focusing his attention on the still slumbering Horus. Isha's questions had awakened old memories, and as he looked at the peaceful, sleeping face of his son, the Lord of Terra could not help but wonder if he had repeated the same mistakes with the Primarchs that his own makers had made with him. With the Eldar Pantheon, with Gork and Mork, with all those immeasurably mighty and dangerous weapons of war masquerading as gods that the Old Ones had forged for the war in heaven. And yet, what choice did he have? What choice did any of them have? For a long while, the Emperor sat at his son's bedside and brooded, but eventually, he sensed Juno marching towards the private chamber, and a moment later, there was a sharp rap on the door. "Come in," he said, crossing his arms, and Juno entered, offering a brief salute. "Report, Shield Captain. We have finished transportation of all of the Lord Primarch's companions to the ship, my lord," Juno said briskly. "We have also retrieved everything they had stolen, and have identified and separated everything they took from the Mechanicum expedition." "Ah, yes, the Mechanicum. Appeasing them wouldn't be terribly hard, and this was merely an expedition distant from Mars, so it truthfully mattered little even if they weren't too happy with him. Still, the Emperor would have to make an effort to soothe their ruffled feathers. Horus clearly had some attachment to this world, and even if it faded in time, Thonia would be part of the Imperium one day, and it would be best to ensure the tech priests here accepted that willingly. "Very good," he said in response to Juno's question. "Have the children been made comfortable?" "Yes, sire. We placed them within the chambers for the diplomats, as you commanded, and the cooks made a feast for them. They appear to be enthralled by their surroundings and the food, though some of them are asking for Horus." The Emperor nodded absently. He had expected as much. Horus would grow apart from the children in time, he was too far above them, and a proper education would consume much of his son's time, but perhaps some of them would grow into valuable servants of the Imperium and become retainers for his son, if Horus still cared by then. Perhaps even an Asteroot or two. It mattered little for the moment. "Tend to them as best as you can," the Guardian of Mankind said. "Have the doctors check them over once they've eaten, and also locate any soldiers among the crew who might have experience dealing with children, and tell them they'll be rewarded if they take some time to look after these." "As you wish," Juno said, bowing. "Was there anything else, my lord?" "No, you may go. I will see you in a little while," the Emperor said. Normally, he would have left with her, to speak to Captain Alexandros and deal with the Mechanicum, but he could sense Horus stirring from his sleep behind him. Juno saluted, then left the chamber, just as Horus awakened. Where am I?" his son said groggily as the Emperor turned back to him. Actually feeling sleep weighing him down was clearly a new experience for the boy, but he was alert soon enough as he looked around. "Oh," Horus said, his gaze filled with a mixture of uncertainty and excitement. "Hello, father." "Hello, my son," the Emperor said, nodding. "It is good to see you awake. And you are aboard my ship, the Epona, specifically in a private room attached to the medical deck." Thanks," Horus replied. "I just felt really tired all of a sudden, never happened to me before." He trailed off with a puzzled frown. "And wait, I'm on the ship? You mean I missed the flight on the shuttle?" The boy seemed immeasurably disappointed by that, which the Emperor could understand. Even after all these millennia, he could never quite forget the wonder he had felt at venturing beyond Terra and into the void beyond for the first time. "My doctors thought you were overwhelmed by the excitement," the Emperor said, his tone as non-committal as he could make it. "It happens." "Yeah, but not to me," Horus protested. "Clearly, it does," the Emperor said, feeling a spark of amusement at the childish annoyance on the boy's face. He might have looked like a teenager, but the Emperor could verify from experience that Horus's expression in that moment resembled that of a toddler his true age more than anything. The boy cast around for a response, clearly trying to think of a viable counter-argument, before visibly deciding it wasn't worth it. "Can I see the ship?" Horus asked instead, a hopeful look entering his eyes. "It's always been a dream of mine." The Emperor's amusement intensified at the boy's attempt to manipulate him. The widening of his eyes, the earnestness injected into his voice, the attempt at emotional manipulation by saying it was a dream of his, the genuine hope and curiosity beneath the guile, All of it made the emperor want to laugh and pat the boy on the head. But he knew Horus would be offended by what he would perceive as condescension, so the emperor instead offered him a faint smile and stood. "Of course, my son. Come, I will show you all that you wish to know about this vessel." Horus nodded, though the emperor felt his uncertainty spike at the word son. He would learn in time, it was understandable given how new they were to each other. The boy jumped to his feet, visibly excited. "Great." He paused, before reining himself in. "I mean, thank you." The emperor nodded, once more suppressing his amusement, before striding towards the door, Horus behind him. Father and son of them stepped out, and the pair of custodians guarding the door immediately saluted. "Lord Emperor, Lord Primarch," they said in unison. Horus blinked, visibly taken aback, especially at the fact that the custodians were taller than him. The emperor noted. "Hello. Who are these guys?" he said, looking to the emperor. "These are two of my custodes, my elite bodyguards," the emperor answered. "An oversimplification, but it would do for now. And now yours as well." Horus frowned, looking somewhat offended at the implication he needed bodyguards. "Right," he said slowly. "And, what's a Primarch?" "It is the title I chose for you, and his brothers, but that was a revelation for later. You may think of it as akin to being a prince. I will explain it to you in more detail at a later time." Horus nodded slowly, clearly unsatisfied with the explanation but still a little too wary to press. "This is the main medical deck," the emperor said, gesturing to the vast, sterile area. "It's where the ill and wounded are tended to." Horus looked around, his eyes lingering on the machines he had never seen before, but he seemed a little unimpressed. "Is that it?" he said. "Not very impressive, is it? I mean, it's big, but..." The emperor chuckled. "The medical deck is not meant to look impressive, but I think you will find the rest of the ship more to your liking." The two of them made their way out of the medical deck, and as the emperor had expected, Horus's eyes widened at the large, richly furnished and painted corridors of the Epona. "Wow," his son said, regarding the gleaming, gilded ship with pleased surprise. Smiling, the emperor continued walking. "Come, there is something I would like to show you." The two of them walked for several minutes, with strides impossible for humans. Some of the soldiers they saw along the way bowed and saluted, a reaction which clearly surprised Horus, and pleased him. Finally, they arrived at the doors of the bridge, large and ornate, decorated with a golden eagle against a gleaming black surface, with two more custodians standing guard. At the emperor's nod, they opened the doors and he entered the stratageum, Horus close behind. "Your Majesty." Captain Alexandros sprang her to feet from the command chair as did the rest of the crew when they entered, all of them saluting sharply. "And Lord Primarch, we are honored to meet you," she said, nodding to Horus and bowing deeply. "I am honored to meet you as well," Horus said, clearly trying to make his language more formal and project a more regal image. To most mortals, his attempt at courtly manners would have appeared flawless, enhanced as it was by the boy's own psychic aura, but the emperor saw it for the child's clumsy attempt at emulating others that it was better than any mortal child could manage, of course, but that was still what it was at its core. It was a start. "Captain," the emperor said, making his voice resonate across the bridge with a thought. "We will speak later, but I would like some privacy, please. Kindly empty the bridge for the moment, I will summon you all back later." Alexandros blinked, visibly surprised but obeyed. "Of course, my lord," she said with another bow before straightening and turning to her crew. "You heard the emperor, let's clear out." The crew was clearly bemused by the command, but they were the best of the best, and their professionalism overrode anything else. In short order, they had all dispersed, leaving the emperor and Horus alone on the bridge. "Come here, Horus, I believe you will enjoy this," the emperor told his son, striding forward to the front of the bridge. Horus followed, and his eyes widened even more as they saw where the emperor was leading him. At the front of the bridge was a large window, out of which one could see the void and the stars. It was better protected than it seemed, the emperor had layered wards over it to ensure it was as strong as any other part of the ship, but it was the view which truly mattered right now. Outside, the stars twinkled, A million shining gems in the darkness of the void. Below them, Thonia itself was visible, a large, grey sphere covered mostly in clouds of pollution, but still an awe-inspiring sight to people who had never been beyond a planet before. Thonia's star could be seen as well, a vast, burning golden orb, brighter and clearer from here than it ever could be from below the planet's polluted atmosphere. And the other planet closest to Thonia, a massive green gas giant, could be seen as well. Horus sucked in a sharp breath at the sight, and childlike wonder and awe swelled within him, emotions far more sharp and potent than anything a mortal could feel. It's amazing," Horus whispered. "I always wanted to, but I never thought." "Yes, it is." The Emperor agreed quietly. He had long become jaded to the beauty of the cosmos, but standing here, reunited with one of his lost sons at last and introducing him to the stars properly for the first time, it brought back some of the wonder he had felt, so long ago, when he had been a different person entirely. This would not last. Soon, he would have to placate the Mechanicum, talk to Isha, return to Terra, begin educating and training Horus properly, introduce the boy to the horrors that plagued the galaxy and many other tasks besides. But for now, the Emperor allowed himself to enjoy the view of the stars with his son. 30. Isha sat down in the sitting room of the Emperor's private chambers, where they had discussed Horus and the navigators, frustration and guilt simmering in her chest. "You fool, what did you think would happen if you asked the Emperor about his origin?" She silently berated herself. It had been an undeniable misstep on her part, a result of letting her curiosity overcome her better judgment. It wasn't as if she would respond well to anyone asking her about the old ones uplifting her, Isha mused bitterly. Why would the Emperor react differently? The memories of her rebirth still haunted her. What the old ones had done, it had all seemed so utterly inconceivable in the days before the war in heaven. The Ether, as her children had named it in their language at the time, had been a much different place then, even further from the way it had been when her children's folly had empowered chaos. At the time, no gods had ruled Immaterium. They had existed, to be certain, many of them, though they were all dead now. But the old ones had been the masters of the Sea of Souls, their supremacy unchallenged, and even the gods dared not encroach on the vast and gleaming thought palaces that were the domain of the old ones, nor to defy their edicts, few as they were. Some had tried, but any god who had ever been so foolish had been ensnared by the defenses of the old ones, gods the size of star systems trapped within vicious ethereal snares. Some, the old ones would let go. Others were taken as test subjects, to be studied and toyed with as the old ones pleased, perhaps even used as power sources. In those days, Isha had never dared to test herself against the old ones. To challenge them was folly for the mightiest of divine spirits, and Isha had not been one of those, even as her children rose to the stars. There had been older races and greater gods then, but none as old and great as the masters of the galaxy. If they did not dare, then how could she and her family hope to do so? Cain had considered it once or twice, but even he had known better. And then, the war in heaven had come. The Ingur and their soulless slaves had torn across the galaxy, devouring souls, drowning the stars in blood and sending the Sea of Souls into turmoil. Isha had still not gone to the thought palaces willingly, in the end, but she had been taken. The old ones had grown desperate, had desired weapons and seen potential in her family and children. She had been caged, her domain chained, the concepts that made up the very core of her being bound as if it were mere flesh and blood rather than the essence of divinity. There were no words in mortal languages to describe what the old ones had done to her. Isha could say they had cast her into fire to be reborn, that they had reshaped her as if she was a sculpture, that they had not touched her at all but cast her into a void where she fell for an eternity until she became what the old one wanted her to be on her own. All of it was true. None of it could convey what had actually happened, because no mortal mind could even conceive of it. If the Emperor's creation had been anything like that, it was no wonder he was tight-lipped on the matter. She was still not sure of his exact origins, only that an old one had a hand in it. He might have been a mortal raised to divinity, or one of humanity's oldest gods reforged into a weapon as she had been, it was hard to say. But she doubted the process had been pleasant. Isha would have to apologize again, and see if she couldn't still find some way to convince him to let her heal Thonia. She did not think he would let her heal the whole planet, but there were things she could do to make it better. Clearing away the pollution and growing a forest or two would be a good start. But first, she needed to compose a proper argument in support of her wish. For the next half a day, Isha stayed within the chambers, doing little but meditating and ignoring the hungry gazes of the infinite storm of daemons in the immaterium, until she finally felt the Emperor's presence approaching the chambers, and stood, waiting for him. A few moments later, the door swung open and Anathema walked in, his expression pensive. To Isha's relief, he did not seem angry or even annoyed. His aura was calm, pleased even, and his expression thoughtful. "Your Majesty," she said, bowing. "Isha," the Emperor greeted. "I once more apologize for my earlier misstep," Isha said carefully. "It was foolish of me not to consider how sensitive a subject it would be for you, and I should not have overstepped my bounds by doing so. It will not happen again, I assure you." The Emperor's eyebrows rose slightly, but he did not reject her words. "Apology accepted," he said after a moment's silence. "But now, it is time for us to go down to Thonia's surface." "Again?" Isha said, surprised as she followed him out of the room. "Is there something else to deal with on the planet?" "The most powerful faction on Thonia is an expedition sent by the Mechanicum to scavenge for lost technology," the Emperor explained as he strode through the gilded hallways. "Horus stole several things from them, which I intend to return, and I also wish to soothe any anger they may feel. This may only be an expedition, far removed from their masters on Mars, but they are still the greatest power on this planet, and may have found valuable relics among the ruins. Horus has some affection for this world as well. Thonia will be part of the Imperium one day, directly under Horus's purview if he wishes it, and it would not do to have the Mechanicum opposed to us when we return." Isha nodded in understanding. "I see," she hesitated for a moment before plunging ahead. "On the subject of Thonia, I was actually hoping you would permit me to do something about the planet's condition." "Oh," the Emperor said, pausing in his stride and turning to face her, forcing Isha to stop as well. "And why do you wish to do that?" "The planet deserves to be healed, and the people on it deserve to live in better conditions. I am not asking that you allow me to terraform the entire world and restore it to its prime, merely that I be allowed to at least make some improvements, such as cleansing the atmosphere and crafting some animal and plant life. It would also be beneficial to your plans. Thonia as it stands is a ruin, and would be of little use to your empire. I can make it more valuable and livable in time." Isha waited after finishing her talk, a little anxiously. If this was a few days ago, she was almost certain the Emperor would have agreed, but after her misstep about his origins, after her near loss of control on the trip to Thonia. The Emperor was silent for several long moments before he spoke. "Very well. You may clear the pollution from the planet, and grow a forest in a location of my choosing. I will perform a full analysis, however, and destroy it if I so choose." Isha bowed her head, relieved. "Of course. Thank you. It will be after I have negotiated with the Mechanicum, however," the Emperor replied, resuming his walk. "I will need to inform them and make sure they do not react aggressively to such a thing." "I understand," Isha replied. She was aware any forest she grew would likely be a target for any faction on the planet, and the Mechanicum, from what she knew of them, would study it at the very least, but given the only other choice was to leave Thonia in its current state, well, that was hardly a choice at all. "Good," the Emperor said, just as they arrived at the hangar bay. They entered the bay, and this time, they were greeted by the sight of the Emperor's soldiers arrayed in military formation on both sides of the bay in anticipation of his arrival. First, there were the custodes, who were so silent and still that they might as well have been golden statues, standing on the right side. Opposite them on the left side were the mortal soldiers, dressed in neat black and gold uniforms, and next to them were a squadron of space marines in white armor, clearly the Star Hunter scouts who had found Thonia in the first place. And at the end of the bay, Isha could see a ship that had clearly been prepared for takeoff, one significantly larger than the one they had used before, easily the size of most of the human houses in the Emperor's capital. It was also even more golden and gilded than the last one, with the symbol of an eagle clutching a lightning bolt painted on the side, and bristling with stronger armor and more weapons. This was a warship meant to impress and intimidate, not a vessel built for speed first and foremost. And more potent than any of the ship's physical defenses were the wards the Emperor had woven around it, invisible to anyone without the ability to wield magic, but still providing far greater protection than the ship's armor. Horus was nowhere to be seen, Isha noted. No doubt at least one reason that the Emperor was taking her down to the planet again was to keep her away from the boy. Shield Captain Juno stepped forward, and saluted. "Your Majesty, the ship is ready. We will depart at your command." The Emperor smiled faintly. "Good. Then, let us go." The plan, as the Emperor had outlined it, was fairly simple. He had already deployed a few custodians to the surface who had negotiated a time and place for a meeting with the Mechanicum. The Emperor would go to meet them and return everything Horus had stolen, then soothe any ruffled feathers. All very straightforward. Isha herself, of course, would not be attending the meeting. She would be staying under the watch of the custodians, with both the ship's wards and the bracelets the Emperor had given her a few years ago to keep her power contained. But Isha was curious. She had yet to meet any humans who were not under the Emperor's banner, the brief glimpse of Horus and his mortal friends aside. What were these tech priests like? How did they differ from ordinary humans? She had learned something of what the Mechanicum was like during her time on Terra, but that wasn't the same thing as actually laying eyes on them. And thus, she had persuaded the Emperor to let her observe the meeting from a distance. It had been easier than she had expected, and Isha got the distinct impression he had been slightly amused by her request, but he had seen no harm in it and acquiesced. So here she was, sitting on the ship's lowered ramp but still within its wards and surrounded by custodians as she enhanced her senses to observe the Emperor's meeting with the tech priests. The ship had landed atop a large building, which was not very tall but had a large, wide roof which could comfortably accommodate the vessel. It was roughly half a human mile away from the actual meeting place, which was at the edge of the Mechanicum's territory. The Mechanicum's fortress certainly stood out among the rest of Thonia, Isha had to admit as her enhanced eyes swept across it. It had obviously been one of Thonia's hive cities once, but the Mechanicum had their mark. Their symbol, the half-human and half-machine skull, was everywhere. The fortress was also in far better condition than anything she had seen on Thonia so far, a hub of machinery and industry, with heat and energy flowing through the entire fortress and releasing smoke into the air through shafts carved into the roofs. There were tech priests and various other humans milling through the fortress. There were also a number of machines, some with simple souls akin to animals, others more complex and intelligent, as much as humans, if still dedicated to their tasks. But the tech priests and the acolytes made up only a minority of the fortress's population. The majority were the workers. They were menial workers, purely human, working in terrible conditions, Isha noted with a frown. But there were also others, soldiers and servants alike, who were biological but deeply enhanced with cybernetics. There was something wrong with them, Isha realized as she scanned the fortress. They were some combination of flesh and steel, which was to be expected given what she knew of the Mechanicum, but that wasn't it. The tech priests were also more machine than human, and they didn't give off the fundamental feeling of wrongness that the workers did. There was something about the way they moved that was too rigid, something about their souls. Frowning, Isha focused harder, doing her best to ignore the weight of the wards and the bracelets. It had been easier on the previous trip to Thonia, but the ward the Emperor had constructed around that ship then had been weaker, constructed in haste before he departed to meet his son. These ones were stronger and denser. Even so, it only took Isha a few moments to get a proper look, both in the materium and immaterium, at the workers. And what she saw was horrifying. A number of the workers were merely soulless clones, a combination of flesh and steel whose genetic code indicated they had been grown within a vat, who lacked any true spirit, could hardly be considered alive at all. It was disgusting, but the worst part was the rest of them. There were more clones, but these ones had been permitted some degree of higher thought, but were still chained by both simple indoctrination and the machines that had been fused to them since before they were even born. And worst of all, there were those had been normal humans once, who had been mutilated and tortured and converted into abominations, their souls still trapped within their human bodies, suffering from eternal agony. Their minds and souls writhed in pain and sorrow, crippled and enslaved, in desperate need of mercy and release, but unable to do anything but scream within their own minds. It was an abomination. It was worse than what the emperor had done to his custodians. It made her angry, and Isha's first instinct was to rise from where she was sitting, sweep the custodians aside, free all those lost souls and raise a forest that would rip the fortress asunder from the inside. And not only the fortress, but also its cruel masters, to make them scream as their bodies transformed and turned against them, leaving their souls trapped within the trees their bodies had become to make them suffer in the same way they had inflicted on others. But the blazing presence of the emperor was a warning to do nothing of that sort. Isha forcibly tamped down on her temper and her power before it became noticeable to the custodians. She had to force herself to remain where she was and wait obediently for him to finish his negotiations, no matter how much it burned. Isha had done far worse things and made more bitter compromises throughout her existence, but that did not mean this did not sting. The emperor did not need this one fortress of slavers, surely? Perhaps he needed Mars, but not this place. It would do no harm to his plans to tear it down and free those poor people. But the emperor had gone to appease them instead, in full knowledge of what they were doing. And he knew. How could he not? A small part of her was disappointed, but Isha ruthlessly squashed it. He is not my friend, she reminded herself coldly. Remember Asurian. The emperor is the same. He is stronger than I, his help is needed, but he is not a friend, and his domains and nature do not align with mine. Taking a deep breath, Isha turned her gaze back to the emperor. She had been distracted for longer than she had realized, for she had missed the beginning of the meeting, and he had been talking with the Mechanicum's representatives for some time. The tech priest who had come out to speak to the emperor was almost completely inhuman, with only the barest trace of his organic body left. Instead of legs, he had a mass of tentacles, limbs which made him as tall as a custodes, though still shorter than the emperor. He was surrounded by guards, some of them were those enslaved souls, but others were pure machines, bearing some slight resemblance to the Shihamatans of her children. They numbered more than 100 total, far greater than the number of custodes the emperor had taken, but it hardly mattered. Each of them was overwhelmed by the emperor's power, staring at him in awe, and their leader was no exception. Thank you for the return of our stolen artifacts. The tech priest was saying, his head bowed. Here on Thonia, we must maintain everything we can. The emperor himself was smiling as he responded. Or rather, he was projecting the image of himself smiling. Isha could see the slightly bored expression on his actual face, concealed by his aura, as he spoke. I am happy to have helped. I hope you will forgive my son's transgressions, he is a child and meant no harm. I hope the fresh technology and information I included in the cache will serve as compensation. Isha did not know how the tech priest's mind perceived the emperor's sentence through his own perceptions, and she suspected peering into his mind would only make her angrier, but he seemed happy enough. Of course, the tech priest agreed quickly. The knowledge you have given us, I have only begun to process it, but it is extraordinary. We are honored by your gift. And we would be glad to host you and learn from you, if you wish to stay. No doubt he'd feel less honored if not for the emperor's aura, Isha thought disdainfully. Perhaps he'd want Horus or his friends to be turned into servitors as punishment. The emperor shook his head gently. I am flattered by the offer, but I am afraid I must return to Terra to tend to my affairs. But I will return here one day, and I hope that when I do, we can form a mutually beneficial alliance. Of course, my lord, the tech priest agreed in an almost reverent tone. We will wait for you. Until then, the emperor said, inclining his head. They exchanged a few more parting pleasantries before the emperor and his escort began making their ways back to the ship. Isha did her best to calm herself, altering her body chemicals as necessary. Losing her temper would accomplish nothing, especially after she had already tested the emperor's patience with her previous behavior on this trip. But someday, she would have the power to rival the emperor once more, and she would no longer have to suffer such indignities and tolerate such atrocities. It was a long time away, but it would come, she promised herself. Finally, the emperor returned to the ship, looking pleased with himself. Isha, he greeted. We need only make a short flight now, and then you can begin the cleansing of Thonia's atmosphere. Isha nodded, not trusting herself to speak as they re-entered the large, plush interior of the ship, the ramp rising behind them to seal the ship shut. It was not quite as well decorated as the Epona, but it was spacious enough to hold dozens of people and barely be half filled. The walls were gleaming with the emperor's symbol, an eagle clutching a lightning bolt, emblazoned on them in black. As the emperor had said, it was a short flight. The ship was fast, and soon they were in Thonia's western hemisphere, far from the Mechanicum's fortress. As they flew, the number of humans below them grew smaller and smaller until they had a region where the only life was insects. The emperor gestured to one of the custodians. "Tell the pilot to stop here," he ordered. The custodian departed for the cockpit instantly, as the emperor turned to face Isha. "There is no need for the ship to land, I think," he said. "You can do what you need to do from the air, I believe." "I can," Isha agreed, doing her best to maintain her civil demeanor. "It would be no trouble at all. But, may I remove the bracelets?" The emperor paused for a moment, visibly weighing his options, before he spoke. "Very well." Isha raised her wrists, and he unlocked them with a thought, the bracelets hovering over to him. But even as she enjoyed the feeling of being unrestrained, Isha suspected that this was being allowed primarily because Thonia was more expendable than Terra, and the emperor wanted to see more of what she was capable of. The ramp was lowered once more, and Isha descended to stand on the edge, the emperor behind her. Below her was another hive, but this was one more damaged than the ones she had seen before. It was in complete ruins, simply a massive mountain of metal and stone that had collapsed in on itself, stretching far into the distance, and left essentially no space where any human could live. "What size would you like the forest to be?" Isha asked without turning around as she gathered her power. Energy hummed under her skin, eager to escape and be used on a large scale, to be less constrained for even a short time. The emperor hummed behind her thoughtfully. "It should cover a 10-mile radius, nothing more, nothing less." Isha nodded. Raising her hands, she reached into Thonia's atmosphere, her power spreading through the sky and clouds. Once her grip was firm, she began. Across Thonia, people startled as storms erupted on the planet for the first time in centuries. But these were no ordinary storms. Imbued with Isha's power, these released cleansing showers of water that purified the air and left it cleaner than it had been in millennia. Never staying in one place for too long, the storms and clouds danced through Thonia's skies, moving at speeds impossible for any natural weather phenomenon as they cut through the pollution and gray skies, steadily absorbing and transmuting toxic chemicals and pollutants. The process continued for hours, the storms sweeping across Thonia in harmony like puppets on a string, healing the world as best as they could, until, at last, the skies were a clear blue and golden sunlight was visible on the planet for the first time in centuries. The people were baffled, torn between wonder and fear, but as the days passed and nothing happened, the air simply remaining clean and pure, they slowly adjusted. Many wondered if this was a blessing by the gods, if it was the use of some mysterious technology by the Mechanicum, or something else entirely. The tech priests themselves said nothing to the outsiders, but were as shocked as anyone, though many of them proposed this was the work of the Terran Emperor. No answers were to be found, but most were grateful for the new state of the world. Eventually, some of the more adventurous Thonians, in their travels across the planet, were surprised to find a massive forest where once had been a hive city so utterly ruined during the old night that it had been impossible to live in for anyone. Filled with all sorts of exotic animals and plants that no one had seen before, many greedy warlords sought to claim it as their territory, but the forest was hardy and dangerous, and all attempts at claiming it in the following years failed. Even the tech priests, when they tried to build a base there, failed miserably. The forest developed something of a dark reputation, and it was declared that it would never be conquered. It was some dark work by aliens or even demons, many claimed. But life went on, and eventually, the forest was accepted as simply a mystery that would never be solved or conquered. However, some people, who went to the forest simply out of curiosity and a sense of adventure, found it more hospitable than many claimed. Still dangerous, of course, as any jungle with wild animals, but not entirely hostile to human life. A few of them speculated the forest was simply protecting itself, though how and why it had come to be, still no one could say. 31. For as long as Horus could remember, Thonia had been a world choked in ash and smog. For as long as anyone could remember, really. There were myths about Thonia having had blue skies once, centuries ago, but those were just myths. The idea of Thonia with anything other than dark gray skies was inconceivable. And when Horace had first seen Thonia from space, that had held true. There was nothing vibrant or colorful about the planet. Space itself was fresh and exciting, with the bright glow of the sun and the dazzling distant stars, but Thonia remained as dour and ugly as always. Or it had, at least. Now, as he peered at it again through the deck of the window, it seemed completely alien. The smog was gone as if it had never existed, and Thonia's skies were now sharp and clear. It wasn't exactly colorful, the planet dominated by the gray hive cities and the mountains. But it was brighter than Horace had ever seen it. A vast, shining orb gleaming against the tapestry of the stars. From this distance, it looked nothing like the Thonia Horace had known. This has to be impossible. A whisper came from next to him, and Horace turned to Ezekiel, who was standing next to him, looking out of the window with a stunned disbelief that mirrored Horace's own feelings. This is some kind of joke, right? It can't actually be happening. Ezekiel looked as awkward and out of place as Horace felt. They had been provided with fresh clothes, with black tunics embroidered in gold and white trousers, softer and more expensive than anything they had ever worn before, made of a material Horace didn't recognize. They had washed themselves in the insanely expensive and large baths attached to their rooms. Horace enjoyed it all, but at the same time, neither he nor his friends could shake the underlying feeling of discomfort and alienation. He wanted to say something to Easy, to offer some sort of reassurance, to explain it away, but his tongue felt like lead, and even though the words usually came so easily, he had no idea what to say. This had to be some sort of dream, he thought. A golden man claiming to be his father had appeared out of nowhere, offering to give Horace everything he had ever wanted, and taken him to the stars to a ship from the wildest stories and myths. He was being treated as if he was royalty, because apparently he was, and he and his friends had been showered with comforts that Horace had never known. And now even Thonia itself had been changed so radically. Horace struggled to accept it. A part of him screamed that this was some sick joke, some delusion, that he had actually been captured and his captors were feeding him drugs to keep him compliant, trapped in a dream world. But who could do that? Another part of him asked. Horace had yet to find any poison or drug that actually affected him, and many, many people had tried. The only people on Thonia who might have drugs capable of trapping him in this sort of dream might be the tech priests, and this wasn't their style. There were plenty of horror stories about what tech priests did to people who got into trouble with them. Servitors were the most common, and the idea still sent a chill down Horace's spine, but there were also those simply kept as slaves, used as test subjects, torn apart. But drugs to keep people compliant and happy? No, the tech priests never did anything like that. And yet, Horace wasn't sure. He wanted to accept this was real, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this was some sort of trick. Maybe the Emperor just wanted something from Horace, was just lying to him so he could use him. But there was something about the Emperor that Horace couldn't help but trust. There was something innately familiar and soothing about that blazing golden presence, which spoke to something deep within Horace. That told him this man was really his father, and that every word he said was the truth. Even so, standing aboard the Epona, gazing out in the void, Horace couldn't help but feel awkward and out of place. The starship, this fortress and palace all in one, it was like nothing he had ever known. It was vast and golden and dazzling, with technology and luxuries that would have stunned even the richest gang lord of Thonia. It was everything Horace had ever wanted, but now that it was within his grasp, he felt like he was entering a completely alien world, one which he wasn't part of. And that was the truth, wasn't it? Thonia, the Thonia of days past, was his world, not this ship. Not Terra, where his father had come from. I don't know, Easy, he admittedly softly. I just don't know. Ezekiel stared at him, stunned. Horace couldn't blame him, it was the first time he had ever spoken those words to anyone, but what else could he say? But before Easy could say anything, a voice interrupted from behind them. Lord Primarch. Horace turned to look at the source of the voice and found Captain Alexandris, standing there in her crisp uniform. Captain, he said, the words coming more confidently. Is there something you need? She nodded. It is time for you and your companion to have another meal, a custodes is here to escort you. Her tone was warm and respectful, but Horace didn't miss the way her eyes briefly flickered to Ezekiel. It wasn't contemptuous, exactly, but it was dismissive. It rankled him. Ezekiel was his friend, part of his gang, and had been at his side for years. How dare this woman judge him? He's not my companion, he's my friend. Horace said, a little sharply. The woman seemed a little startled by that, but bowed her head. Of course, Lord Primarch, my apologies. Satisfaction spread through Horace. Most of the ship's crew treated him very respectfully and politely. Maybe part of it was because he was their emperor's son, but Horace was certain most of it was just because of him. People had always treated him like that, even his enemies were stunned by him, and it felt good to know that something hadn't changed. Do you know when my father will be free? Horace asked. I want to talk to him. The emperor had spoken briefly to him upon returning from Thonia, but had disappeared into his study soon after, though with an assurance that they'd talk soon. In particular, Horace wanted to ask him about the scientist Horace had heard his father kept in his employ, some incredible genius with biology who had done a lot of frankly unbelievable work for his father back on Terra. Resurrecting extinct species of animals and plants, raising forests on a planet supposedly as ravaged as Thonia, working on his father's soldiers like the white giants they called Space Marines. Horace had thought the rumors about this mysterious scientist were overblown, but, now, seeing Thonia, he couldn't help but think she must have had some hand in this. He already is. Captain Alexandris replied, clasping her hands behind her back. The custodian came to inform me that your father wishes to dine with you and your friends, Lord Primarch. Horace jolted in surprise, but recovered quickly. The Emperor wanted to dine with him and his gang? He wasn't sure how to feel about that. But there was nothing for it. Come on, easy. Let's go. His friend still looked uncertain but didn't object as they made their way to the doors leading out of the command deck. The crew members maintained a respectful distance, but Horace couldn't help but smile at the awe and curious looks they all kept sending him. Finally, they left the chambers, and found one of the custodians looming outside the door, waiting for them just as the captain had said there would be. It was Valerian, Horace recognized after a moment of examining the medals and markings on the golden armor. Lord Primarch. The giant said, inclining his head, his voice deep and rumbling. Ezekiel shifted nervously next to him, but Horace pasted on a bright smile. Simonas. Let's go. The custodian nodded gravely, and turned on his feet with a grace and speed that shouldn't have been possible for such a large person, with Horace and Ezekiel following only a little reluctantly. Ezekiel kept glancing around at the tall corridors and rich adornments of the Epona, his hands twitching occasionally. Horace couldn't blame him, he felt the same way. The ship was exactly the sort of place he and his gang would have raided for loot on Thonia, but even grander and more magnificent than their wildest dreams. But they didn't have to, did they? The ship's staff and crew had given them everything they had asked for, without question. Clothes, food, tech, books, practically everything they asked for was provided shortly. The Emperor had given them the free run of most of the ship, with only a few sections strictly off-limits. They didn't need to steal anything, they only had to ask. It felt good. But it also felt wrong, and unsatisfying, in a way. The thrill of the heist was something Horace had always enjoyed, and he had a feeling it would be a long time before he felt it again. Horace looked at Easy again, and had to suppress a wince when he saw his friend's attention had drifted from their surroundings to Valerian. He looked even more uncomfortable and intimidated, sneaking repeated glances at the custodian, clearly nervous. So, Simonas, what did my father do on Thonia? Horace, hoping to distract the custodian from noticing Ezekiel's fear. And well, he was really curious about what his father had done to clear up the planet. Next to him, his friend also perked up in curiosity a bit, wanting to know more. But the custodian did not so much as turn his head to look at Horace as he responded. That is for His Majesty to tell you, Lord Primarch. Horace frowned. Can't you tell me something, at least? Thonia is my home, I'm just curious. Simonas remained impassive. My duty is that of your guard, and that alone. My apologies, but I am not allowed to speak to you about such matters. Just because you're my guard doesn't mean we can't talk. Horace said reasonably. If we're going to spend time together, shouldn't we get along? I am afraid not, Simonas replied simply. It is best for a guard to maintain distance, to avoid any complications. If you desire companionship beyond that of your friends, there are many on this ship who would be glad to accommodate you, but I cannot. Horace suppressed a scowl. Anyone else would have already told him what he wanted by now, but the custodians might as well have been one of the Mechanicum's automatons for all the effect his words had on them. He didn't like it. No one had ever seemed so immune to Horace's words. Even people who were trying to kill him, well, a bunch of them, including Easy, were part of his gang now. And even the ones he hadn't converted, he had been able to make them angry, to dance on his strings, to get some sort of emotion out of them. But the custodians cared nothing for any of that. To them, he was just their lord's son, nothing more. Horace hadn't exactly had time to try out all his tricks on them yet, but it felt wrong. For the rest of the trip, there was silence, until they finally arrived at the chambers that had been assigned to Horace and his friends. The doors were large and ornate, a deep crimson embossed with golden eagles and lightning bolts. On either side of the door, there were two more custodians standing guard, and with a curt nod, Simonas fell into line alongside them. Glad to be rid of him, Horace and Ezekiel moved closer to the doors, which opened automatically at their approach, and let them in. And what Horace choked in surprise at what he saw. The rooms the Emperor had assigned to Horace and his friends were large and lavish, with more than a dozen bedrooms, a large sitting room and all sorts of expensive furnishings. There were huge shelves stacked with books, though not in any language he or his gang could read, and an entertainment center with all sorts of devices that Alyssa and several of the others had eagerly taken to playing with and dismantling. If Horace hadn't wanted to explore the ship so much, he would have joined them. From the snooping he had done, Horace knew that the chambers were actually meant for diplomats, and he couldn't help but take a little pride in the fact that his gang had been deemed important enough to stay in them. But still, as excited as everyone was, they couldn't help but be a little nervous, a little afraid of what was going to happen. They had spent years on the run, and this all seemed too good to be true. But now, that tense atmosphere was completely gone, replaced by a raucous cheer. In the center of the large and lavish sitting room assigned to them, at the head of the huge gleaming wooden table, which had a feast of luxurious food and wine arrayed on it, was the Emperor, smiling and laughing as he ate with Horace's gang. It was a completely alien sight, and Horace couldn't help but stare. His father, cool and regal and distant, was smiling with a glass of wine in hand as he told a story, and around him, Horace's entire gang was regarding him with enthralled attention. Erek, who never trusted anyone, was looking up at the Emperor with a starry-eyed gaze. Alyssa, who held everyone at arm's length, was eagerly asking him questions. Jealousy clawed at Horace's chest. The way they looked at the Emperor, that awe in their eyes and the way they hung on his every word, his gang had never done that for anyone except him. It stung to see them so easily charmed by some alien king, even his own father. The way they were all looking at the Emperor, it was as if he was a god. But before Horace could dwell on it too deeply, his father's eyes turned to him and the Emperor's smile widened. "My son. Come," he said, beckoning to the empty chair next to him. Everyone else's heads turned to him, and his gang grinned to see him, waving at him, as rowdy and exuberant as ever. Despite his envy, the Emperor's words sent a rush of warmth through his chest, and Horace found himself walking to sit next to the Emperor, gesturing to Easy to find his own seat. "Father," he said, trying to sound as formal and regal as his father. "I didn't expect this." The Emperor had wanted to give Horace rooms of his own, within the Emperor's own private chambers, but Horace had refused to be separated from his gang. To see his father here, laughing and drinking with his gang, was confusing. The Emperor chuckled. "Well, one must always make some effort to connect with one's people," he said, pouring another glass of shimmering crimson liquid for Horace. "Speaking of which, Erek here tells me that your gang has a tradition of sealing deals and membership with a drink." "Yeah," Erek confirmed before hastily correcting himself. "I mean, Your Majesty." "They do," Horace said, giving his father a puzzled look, wondering what this had to do with anything. "Well, I am not part of your gang, but I am your father and it would be improper of me not to participate in my son's traditions. The emperor replied, offering the glass to Horus. So, shall we? A toast to a better future. Horus hesitated. I'm not dash. Come on, Horus. Alyssa said, grinning. Let's do it. All of us. All of us. Everyone cheered, to the future. Horus couldn't help but accept the glass, the atmosphere around him infectious. To the future, he agreed, draining the glass in one gulp as the emperor did the same, and a cheer went up around them. The emperor couldn't help but smile, feeling pleased as the servants carted off most of the children to their rooms. It had been quite some time since he had either tended to children or attempted to connect with commoners. The past several centuries had been far too busy for that, but he was glad that he hadn't lost his touch. His eyes drifted to one of Horus's friends, Erek, who had passed out and was snoring as a pair of servants picked him up and carted him away. Even from this distance, the emperor could smell the wine on the boy's breath, and the Lord of Terra made an idle note to send the medics to look at the children tomorrow. Giving them all alcohol was perhaps not the best of ideas, but his physicians would ensure that no harm would come to them, and he had needed to endear himself to his son and his son's friends. Next to him, Horus's voice rose up. Father. The emperor turned to the boy, smilingly slightly. He had worn away at quite a bit of the boy's wariness today. Not all of it, he had not made the primarches to be stupid, after all, but quite a bit. Yes, son. The boy hesitated for a moment. He wasn't remotely affected by the wine, his physiology saw to that, but something had clearly been nagging at him for a while and the emperor already knew what it was. How did you clear Thonia's atmosphere? An experimental device, my son, the emperor replied steadily, having prepared answers beforehand. It is quite potent, though it did show some issues that still require adjustment. Horus frowned slightly. I heard that you have some sort of biologist on your payroll? Didn't she help? So the boy had already found that out. The emperor couldn't help but be proud of the snooping, but still, Horus wasn't ready to hear the truth. She did, yes. She helped build the device and conduct the clearing process. Even if Isha had been in a dark mood ever since the trip to Thonia. She had said nothing, keeping to herself and being stiffly polite, but it wasn't hard to notice. The emperor knew what it was, of course. He had noticed her scanning the Mechanicum's fortress, and knew she had seen the servitors. It was unsurprising she was revolted by them, given her attitude towards simple clone soldiers. It was honestly rather tiresome at this point. Isha's soft heart was something he had used to his advantage on multiple occasions now, but it was still aggravating that an Eldar warp construct whose age surpassed his own could be so sentimental. She had fought in the war in heaven, had clashed with chaos countless times over millions of years. Could she not understand the necessity of such things? Can I meet her? Horus asked, interrupting his father's thoughts. No. The emperor's mind rebelled at the motion. It had been difficult enough to let Isha run a skin on the boy to ensure that chaos had left no mark on him. Letting them meet properly? Certainly not. But he would have to phrase it more delicately for his son. I'm afraid not, the emperor answered. She is very busy, and I am afraid the projects she are tending to are time-sensitive. Perhaps later. Or never. Horus looked disappointed, but did not press the point. The emperor knew that wasn't the end of this, however. He had not forgotten the experiences of raising many children, and one of his offspring giving up so quickly at something they wanted? A laughable idea. There were many things he could distract Horus with, however, and his son was very young. Horus had never been a son before, but the emperor had been a father many times. It would take some effort, but the emperor was sure he could keep the boy distracted. And there is the central section of the Baihung hive, where I live, and you will be living with me. The emperor told Horus, gesturing to the top of the vast mountain. They were once more standing at the window of the Epona's bridge, peering down at the imperial capital as the ship descended towards the hive's spire zone. That's amazing, Horus said softly, his eyes wide as he looked down at the mountain-sized arcology and the city beyond it, the awe that had been there since they had first entered Terra's atmosphere only growing. The boy was trying to present the image of being composed, but the emperor could sense how he really felt. Indeed, and there are many more things within I am sure you will find equally amazing. The emperor said with a smile. It had been an enjoyable few days, and the Epona had taken a slower pace home than it had towards Thonia, to give Horus some time to adjust. He had missed this, the emperor acknowledged to himself. He could never allow himself to forget what Horus's true purpose was, but it felt good to have an awestruck child following him around again, hanging on his every word. But this grace period would have to end soon, and Horus's education would begin. Still, no harm in relishing it a little longer. What kind of things, father? Horus asked, with barely concealed excitement. The emperor opened his mouth to reply, but before he could say anything, a psychic pulse came from the palace below, invisible to most, but bright and urgent to the emperor's mind, Malkador's power easily recognizable. Revelation, there is a problem. We need to talk immediately. 32. Terror took Horus's breath away, even after they had descended from orbit. His father's capital was like nothing Horus had ever seen. Many of Thonia's gang lords tried to make their domains grander and more imposing, to show off their money and power, but even the richest gang on Thonia didn't have anything like this. His father's fortress, Baihung, was literally a hive carved into a mountain, reaching so far into the sky that the peak was wreathed in white clouds. Golden spires and silver platforms decorated the mountain like enormous jewels, with smaller airships buzzing around it like insects. In the valley below lay an enormous, glittering city. It wasn't quite as grand as Baihung itself, but it was still fascinating. From the Epona, Horus could see an erratic mix of buildings such as grey skyscrapers and factories that wouldn't have been out of place on Thonia, white palaces that looked like they were trying to copy Baihung, and an enormous number of smaller buildings in a dizzying array of colors. And the forest. Horus had never seen anything like that before, with tall, proud trees rising high into the sky, their green leaves practically shining. Even the sky and air wasn't quite as dark as Thonia. Or at least, as Thonia used to be. Horus wondered why his father hadn't tested his experimental device here on Terra instead. Why Thonia instead of his home world? Horus couldn't help but be excited by it all as the Epona finally landed, eager to explore all that he had seen, but there was one thing making it hard: his father. The Emperor had seemed to share his excitement for the last few days, until just half an hour ago, as they had finally come within sight of Baihung. They had been talking, and then the Emperor had abruptly told Horus to get ready to leave the ship and then disappeared. Now, as Horus and his friends all stood in the hangar bay of the ship, preparing to leave, his father was nowhere to be seen despite his promises to show him the Baihung hive. What had happened? "Hey, where's your dad, boss?" Arek asked, eyeing the custodians standing a short distance away a little nervously. While his gang had warmed to the Emperor considerably, they couldn't help but regard the custodians and space marines with some nervousness. "I don't know," Horus admitted, irritated at having to admit it. Alyssa, leaning against a wall, frowned uneasily. "Did something happen?" "No," Horus muttered. "We were just looking down on Terra, and he was telling me what he was going to show me. Then, suddenly, his mood changed, he told me to get ready to get off the ship and then he left." Alyssa said, clearly puzzling it over. "Too bad we have to leave this ship," Eric said, looking back wistfully at where they'd come from their rooms. "Damn nice place to live. My father told me we'd be getting an even nicer place to live soon." Horus told him. The ship was fascinating, but he really wanted to see Terra. "Even nicer than this," Eric said, his eyebrows rising. "Damn. Never mind where we're going to live, we're going to see another planet," Ezekiel said, looking excited. His mood had improved considerably over the last few days, and he seemed as in awe of the Emperor as anyone. Another planet, just like Mikhail from the old legends. Mikhail was an old myth on Thonia, of a man who had built a ship that could sail the stars, and explored 1,000 new worlds, bringing back vast wealth and glory to Thonia. Every child on Thonia dreamed of being like him, and Horus had always believed he would be. He just hadn't thought that day would come so soon. "Horus." They all turned at the sound of the Emperor's voice, who was striding towards them, a grim expression on his face. "Horus, I've received some news from Terra, and there are matters I need to tend to urgently," the Emperor said briskly. We'll talk later, but for now, I'll be sending you and your friends to settle in your new homes. Are we understood? Yes, father. Horus said automatically, even as questions nagged at him. But dash. Good. The emperor said, not letting Horus finish. Be good son, and don't cause any trouble. With that, the emperor strode away towards the hangar door, which opened as he approached it, a ramp lowering, and the emperor descended down it rapidly. Horus and the gang followed as quickly as they could, struggling to keep up with the emperor's much larger strides. They were unable to catch up, but as he reached the top of the ramp, Horus caught a glimpse of his father walking away from the ship with a shorter figure in a hooded cloak and robes at his side, the two of them already baffling far. And at the bottom of the ramp was another custodian. This one was taller and larger than the others, his golden armor with more decorations and medals, a large, gilded spear in his hand. All of Horus's instincts screamed at him that this man was dangerous, more so than anyone he had ever met save the Emperor himself. Not even the Space Marines or other custodians made Horus as nervous as this one did. And the spear he was holding, something about it was strange, reminding Horus of his father for some reason, but he was unable to say why. Before he could think about it too deeply, the custodian called up to him, his voice deep and thunderous, carrying to them easily despite the distance. Greetings, Lord Primarch. I am Constantine Valder, Captain General of the Adeptus Custodes. Your father has entrusted me with the security of you and your companions for the time. Accommodations have been arranged for you all, please follow me. Horus exchanged a look with his friends. This new custodes was even more intimidating than the rest, but what else could they do? With little other choice, they descended down the ramp to meet Valder. Form a line, please. Valder said, his voice even more intimidating up close. Not you, Lord Primarch, but it would be best if the rest of you could move in an orderly fashion. Horus frowned, but couldn't quite bring himself to object. His gang, usually rowdy and rebellious, fell into line quietly, all of them eyeing the Captain General nervously. Valder led them down the platform towards a large gate leading into the mountain, Horus at his side and the rest of them in a not quite straight line behind him. There were people milling around everywhere, who peered at them curiously, but none of them came close, Valder's presence like an invisible, moving shield. Horus wanted to ignore the custodian and go talk to them, to explore the fortress on his own, but something told him Valder wouldn't like that. More than Valder, Horus suspected his father wouldn't like that, and the idea of displeasing the Emperor made something inside him squirm. The inside of the fortress was as impressive as the outside, decor acted in a fashion similar to the Epona but even richer and more magnificent, with hallways so tall and wide that even Valder was utterly untroubled by them. They kept walking deeper and deeper into the mountain, the various people they saw bowing respectfully from a distance, but staying away. It was all incredibly awkward and uncomfortable, and Horus longed to make conversation, to say something, anything, but Valder's presence was too much. Everything about the Captain General set Horus on edge for some reason he couldn't identify. He had dealt with threats before, but no one had ever made him feel like this. A quick glance at his friends revealed that they were also unusually quiet and subdued, and not talking among themselves like Horus would have expected. Finally, Valder stopped in front of a set of large doors, where there were a bunch of normal humans in white and gold uniforms waiting for them. Lord Primarch, a man at the front with graying brown hair and pale skin said, stepping forward and bowing deeply, before speaking in accented but understandable Thonian. Horus wondered where he had learned it. I welcome you and your companions to this place, the man said formally. I am Hadrian. These are the accommodations for your companions, and have been outfitted to make them all as comfortable as possible. If you require anything else, I and the rest of the staff are available to procure it for them. Wait, my companions? What about me? Horus demanded. Hadrian seemed taken aback, but before he answered, Valder spoke. Lord Primarch, your chambers are not here. I will be escorting you to them shortly. Wait, what? Horus said, indignation overcoming his nervousness of Valder. This is my gang. I have to stay with them. The Emperor has informed me that you are to stay in the royal chambers with him. Valder replied. You may come down to interact with your friends whenever you please. The servants and Horus's gang all watched the exchange, eyes bouncing back between the two of them, the servants especially looking shocked, but Horus ignored them. "No," Horus said firmly. "These are my people, and I'm going to stay with them. I don't care what you say." For the first time, the custodian seemed to, not hesitate, but pause. "It is against your father's wishes. If my father has a problem with it, he can take it up with me." Horus growled. He thought the Emperor wouldn't try this again after the Epona. He would not be separated from his gang. They were his. There was a long silence, and for several terse moments, Horus wondered if Valder would try to force him to his chambers. But finally, "Very well. You may stay here until the Emperor comes to fetch you." With those words, Valder turned on his heel in a movement so fluid it should have been impossible, and strode away, deeper into the halls of Baihung. Horus watched him go as his gang burst into chattering behind him, satisfied at his success, but unable to ignore the sudden pit in his stomach. "Nardhan Dumay and his generals have fallen to chaos," Malkador informed the Emperor grimly as they entered the latter's study. "I am not sure how long he has been corrupted, but all the evidence that we've gathered leads me to believe that the four have been planning this for some time." A thunderous scowl crossed the Emperor's face as they strode down the long carpet to his desk. "What did they do?" "The Pan-Pacific Empire launched a new assault on our border, with a number of warp-tech weapons not seen since the fall of Ursh. I suppose now we know where Colligan's remaining pet sorcerers went. They knew I'd leave as soon as I located Horus," the Emperor said coldly, and Malkador could see his mind whirring, calculating, and considering the various outcomes. What happened on the border? Malkador's grip on staff tightened, his knuckles going white. "Nothing good. They took our forces by surprise, and if not for the 4th Legion, might have managed to overrun the border fortress and outpost entirely, allowing them to invade our territory while you were gone. The battle is still raging, as a matter of fact. I have dispatched custodians to investigate and back up the 4th Legion." Ushotan did well, then. The Emperor mused as he strode over to the window, gazing out at Baihung with his hands clasped behind him. Despite his calm tone, Malkador could see the reflection of his eyes in the mirror as they glowed, slowly but steadily turning a molten gold. Outside, the sun was setting, casting an ominous red glow upon the heart of the Imperium. "He did," Malkador agreed, taking a seat at the desk. "There was a time when the Thunder Warrior legions would never have been given anything as mundane as border duty. They were too berserk, too reckless, too arrogant. A hammer and never a shield. Those days were behind them, thankfully, but the reason for that was also likely the reason for this." The Emperor was quiet for a moment, even as his presence in the Immaterium crackled with thunder and flame. "What of the Pan-Pacific Empire itself? How much of it has been overrun by chaos?" "We are still gathering information, but all reports indicate that the vast majority of the Empire's leadership, ranging from Dumay's highest generals to most of the regional governors, are all corrupted by chaos. A few are still holding out, but Dumay is working on purging them. I have already dispatched offers to the renegades. And on the ground level, the usual human sacrifice has begun, and Dumay's scientists have begun gathering even more test subjects. Not that Dumay's research camps had ever been anything less than monstrous, but this was a new low. But we do not think chaos has truly consumed any significant territory yet. The situation may yet be salvaged. That is good news, at least." The Emperor's rage did not abate in the slightest, however, and he doubted his next words would improve Revelation's mood. But this was the most important thing of all. "There is one more thing. We believe that Dumay has discovered an STC, and is working on reactivating and producing it." In the silence that followed, the Emperor's aura, already a sun to Malkador's senses, became even harsher and more wrathful, almost becoming a supernova in its blinding light and power. A lesser man would have been forced to his knees, and even Malkador could not help his heavier breathing, glad he had taken the opportunity to sit down. "They dare," the Emperor said softly, "to try this again." "It seems so," Malkador said, leaning back in his chair, trying to conceal his trepidation. Even he found the Emperor's fury unnerving, though he could hardly blame him. Malkador had been born in the twilight of humanity's golden age, just before the galaxy had burned in iron and warp fire. He knew all too well what iron men in thrall to chaos could do. Fighting infinite legions of iron soldiers warped by ruin and sorcery, their eye glowing with malicious fire, watching world after world crumble and burn. Friends and comrades dying each day, and hope dying with them, spending decades trapped in the same battle, wondering if there was even anything left fighting for. I truly thought Khalagan would be the last of the Chaos Warlords. I saw nothing of this in my visions. The Emperor's voice simmered with barely contained rage. We expected something like this for a while. Chaos was bound to react to the rapid acceleration of our plans thanks to Isha. Malkador replied as evenly as he could through the choking haze of his friend's power. Their original plans had projected at least another half-century to bring Terra and the rest of Sol to compliance. Isha's aid meant that even Malkador's most pessimistic estimates had shortened that time span to another 20 years before they could begin expanding beyond Sol. A response from Chaos to their unexpected speed and victories had been inevitable. But this was still a disaster. Mopping up even singular city-states corrupted by Chaos was a painful and time-consuming process, and having to do it for the largest remaining empire outside of the Imperium itself. Not to mention the obvious lengths Chaos had gone to in order to prevent them from detecting this. For all that even the Emperor's foresight was far less clear than it had once been, rarely had Chaos managed to conceal something from him so completely, to the point none of them had even suspected Dumay of falling. In fact, the only other time that Malkador could think of had been the theft of the Primarches. And they certainly have other plans in the works as well. No doubt. For a long moment, there was silence. The Emperor's gaze became distant as he cast his gaze beyond the veil of time to both look upon the Pan-Pacific Empire as it was now and to assess all the possible futures that he could, seeking to penetrate any shroud that Chaos may have laid upon them. In the warp, his power condensed, no less bright than it had been a few moments, but becoming more focused to cut through the haze of madness that lay upon the Sea of Souls. After what was a moment in reality but an eternity in its poisoned mirror, the Emperor turned, his eyes refocusing on Malkador. I will deal with the Pan-Pacific Empire myself, he said. Prepare the Itos Dios. Summon the entire Legio Custodes, I want the entirety of the 10,000 with me. Gather all the Space Marines that have no critical duties and deploy them as well. I have no intention of allowing Chaos to ruin so much of our effort. Inform Isha that she is to prioritize the production of war rations and medicines, especially to counter Chaos. The Emperor paused for a moment, apparently considering something. Also tell her that her access to the rest of Baihung is restricted until I return. She is to stay within the fortress at all times, under the wards. Malkador grimaced but nodded. Isha would be undoubtedly displeased by such a restriction, but with the Emperor gone for however long it would take to deal with the Pan-Pacific Empire, some of the freedom they had given her would have to be revoked. I will do as you say. But what of the boy? Horus will be fine. The Emperor said briskly. He is a Primarch, he can be self-sufficient for a time. I want you to begin on his education, and find him the best teachers. Very well. Will you speak to him before you go, at least? No, there is no time. Malkador frowned slightly. He will feel abandoned. The Sigillite warned. You met him only a few short days ago and now you are already leaving. I will make it up to him when I return. The Emperor said shortly. Send the Itos Dios with the gathered forces. I will be going ahead on my own. And before Malkador could say anything else, the Emperor erupted into flames and vanished. 33. The return trip to Terra was almost surprising in how uneventful it was. Even if it had been irritatingly slow. Truth be told, Isha would have preferred it if the Emperor had driven the ship back to Terra with the same urgency as he had traveled to Thonia. But she was in no mood to actually talk with him and she doubted he would have agreed even if she was, clearly wanting to give his son time to adjust. So Isha had spent most of the trip in her chambers, doing her best to ignore the hungry gaze of the infinite legions of daemons as the ship traversed the currents of the ether. Unfortunately, there wasn't much else to occupy her attention. She could feel the sorrow and fear and rage of her children bleeding into the warp, as they desperately sought a solution to the horrors they now faced. The determination of those seeking a new path made her proud, even as the arrogance and apathy of those who stubbornly clung to the old ways made her angry. But she could not reach out to them, no matter how much she wanted to. Furthermore, Isha could not help but brood on the matter of the servitors. It still rankled that she could not free them, or even punish their tormentors. But to do that would have been to risk everything she had accomplished since escaping Slaanesh, meager as it was. It was hypocritical in some ways to rage at the Emperor's tolerance of such things, Isha knew. She had tolerated worse, she had done worse. What was the fate of a few thousand mortals compared to the atrocities of the war in heaven? But still, the Emperor's indifference stung. He did not have to tolerate such things. There were threats on the horizon, yes, ones that needed to be urgently prepared for, but he had no need of that fortress of monstrous slavers on a single, insignificant planet, surely. What harm would it have done to his plans to crush them? Instead, he had bargained with them, apologized for the entirely harmless trouble that his son had caused and given them gifts. Isha sighed bitterly. What was even the point of brooding about this? She could do nothing. Oh, certainly, she could argue with the Emperor about it, risk her agreement and position, ultimately convince him of nothing and be able to do nothing for those poor people. She longed for freedom, to be able to go to her children, to strike at her enemies. As humans said, a gilded cage was still a cage, and even with the loosened restrictions over the past few years, Isha did not enjoy being the Emperor's servant. He had never referred to it in such terms, but she did not bother to delude herself about what her position was. It did not help that having to play this role meant suppressing aspects of herself. Being confined to a mortal form was constraining enough, but she also had to keep herself focused on one aspect, on the domains that were useful and acceptable to the Emperor. Denying herself was exhausting, and Isha wondered if the Emperor had ever dealt with anything similar. Did he even have aspects? But in the end, it didn't matter. She could not leave. Not just because of her agreement with the Emperor, not just because she could not afford to make an enemy of him, but because the four were always there, eager for their chance. Isha was unsure if Kurnortsenteka's brief interest in her would linger or if that had just been the usual squabbling of the ruinous powers, the petty desire to deny their rivals something they wanted. But Slaanesh and Nurgle would certainly want her, to consume her, to enslave her, to imprison her, it mattered not. All those fates were equally terrible. In some ways, the whole situation reminded her of the war in heaven, of being a soldier for callous masters in opposition to an even more terrible enemy. For all that she resented the Old Ones, Isha could not claim that letting the Citan win and sever the Materium and Immaterium would have been better than what had happened in the end. And the Emperor, for all that he infuriated her and reminded her of the cold, clinical detachment of the Old Ones at times, was not that far gone. Not yet. How long would that last, she wondered. More and more, it seemed like she and the Emperor would inevitably go down the same path as, well, not she and the Old Ones, but her and Asuryan. And Asuryan had truly been her friend, once, countless eons ago. But in the end, it had not been enough. She and the Emperor did not have even that bond which she and Asuryan had shared once. How was she supposed to build an alliance out of this cold, calculated transaction? To convince the Emperor to respect her as an equal, to make him understand that they could do more together than apart. Isha needed the Emperor's protection, and more than that, she needed to make an ally out of him. For both their people to not only survive but also live, they needed to work together. To be more than just a warlord and the refugee he had agreed to protect in exchange for knowledge. But how they were ever going to reach that point, Isha did not know. Isha was relieved when the Epona finally returned to Terra. Gilded cage or not, it was good to be out from under the hungry gaze of chaos. What was surprising was that the Emperor left without her. She had expected more inquiries on what she could do to speed up his projects, a new task, a demand to know why she was displeased with him, something. Instead, he had simply gone off without saying a word to her. Isha would have thought he was busy with his son, but the blazing star of the Emperor's presence and the bonfire that was the boy had split up, the Emperor heading for his study with Malkador, the boy to another part of the fortress with his friends. Curious. The Emperor was clearly strongly attached to his son already, why the sudden change in behavior after the past few days? But it wasn't any of her business how the Emperor acted as a parent, she reminded herself. That fell outside the purview of their current arrangement, and wasn't even part of the alliance she needed. So Isha put that aside, and went to check on the projects she had left behind, once more making her way to the extension of the fortress where her primary greenhouses resided. Baiheng seemed very busy, with people scurrying about everywhere, but Isha paid it no mind until she reached her destination. Strangely, as she stepped out into the evening air, there was no one there except the guards. The automated systems were running, and Isha had designed the crops to all be self-sustaining, but the absence of any of the Emperor's scientists was surprising. Several of them had their own projects, and a few were always eager to pore over her work again. Isha extended her senses, and realized they were all grouped in a deeper part of the mountain, in the labs where the space marines were made. A part of the fortress she was not permitted access to. Frowning, Isha turned to one of the guards standing at the entrance even as she scanned the greenhouses to check the crops were all growing smoothly. "Has something happened?" she inquired, noting that everything seemed to be going well. It had only been a few days, but it never hurt to check. "Why is no one here?" The guard, a tanned young man with brown hair and blue eyes named Leon, looked vaguely uncomfortable. Isha had met him a few years ago, but the distance that the Emperor mandated between him and her subjects meant that even though guarding these farms was part of his regular duties, she had never established any sort of rapport with him, as Isha would have with the guards in her own temples and palaces before Asurian's edict. "The war with the Pan-Pacific Empire has flared up again, ma'am. Everyone has been ordered to work on supplementing the war effort, with everything else secondary." "I see." Isha frowned. That did explain why they were all in that part of the fortress. But she was mildly surprised she hadn't been informed and given some task already. Perhaps Malkador intended to report to the Emperor, and then the anathema would decide what she was to do. But the Pan-Pacific Empire, from Isha's admittedly limited knowledge of other factions on Terra, they should have had nothing that could force an emergency like this. Had something happened? And that was when Isha felt the Emperor teleport out of the palace to the other side of the planet, his power and anger rolling through the warp with golden lightning and thunder that she felt echo down to the very bones of her mortal form. Well, that answered that question, she supposed. "Lady Isha." "Lord Malkador." The Eldar goddess crossed her arms, leaning against the table of her laboratory. She and Malkador rarely interacted without the Emperor present, but this didn't seem like a normal situation. "There has been a change of plans," the Sigillite said after a moment, from his seat at one of the tables. "By the Emperor's command, you are to focus your efforts on the production of war rations and medicines, especially ones for countering chaos. All non-military projects are of lower priority, and if necessary, should be suspended indefinitely." Isha's eyebrows rose. "May I know the reason for this?" It had been years since the Emperor had ordered her to focus exclusively on supplementing his war machine. Malkador grimaced slightly. "The Pan-Pacific Empire has fallen to chaos," he informed her grimly. "And we believe they have unearthed a STC which allows for the production of Iron Men soldiers. They have not yet found a way to activate it, but the Emperor intends to crush them before they can do so." Ah! Isha had not paid a great deal of attention to humanity before all this, too distracted with her children's descent into madness, but she had noticed when the three had managed to corrupt legions of iron soldiers with abilities comparable to that of the psychomatons that her own children used. It would have been impossible not to. And she had gleaned only a few details of the Iron War from the Emperor. What he had been willing to divulge was worrying. If chaos could gain control of such a force again, well, it explained why the Emperor had gone so abruptly and why his presence in the ether was radiating cold fury and determination. "Of course," she said finally to Malkador. "I will increase production immediately. Is there anything else I can do to help?" Malkador's face showed no hesitation, but Isha could sense his brief burst of caution and fear all the same. "Simply keep on doing what you are already doing. However, I am to inform you that until the Emperor returns, your freedom has been restricted once again. You are to remain within the fortress at all times, and no longer travel out to the city, even the forest." Isha's lips thinned, but after a moment she nodded, having to suppress a roll of her eyes when Malkador seemed surprised. She disliked losing the freedom she had been given, but the Emperor would likely be gone for several weeks, at least. Truth be told, she was surprised he was even going so far as to leave her with access to the fortress at all, instead of taking her with him or having her confined to her chambers for the duration of his absence. He must be truly afraid of these men of iron to decide that leaving her alone in the heart of his power was an acceptable choice. Not that she could blame him. As much as the Emperor angered and frustrated her, she could sympathize with both his strategic and personal concerns in this case. The idea of chaos making a resurgence on Terra was a troublesome one. Isha would never feel completely safe on this planet, given her status as the Emperor's guest, but it had been good to know that all major bastions of the Force worshippers had been eradicated. And Terra was not her home as it was the Emperor's. To spend centuries rooting out any trace of chaos on the planet only for it to make such a return, it would cut deeply. No wonder he was going to such extreme measures. I will remain with the fortress, do not worry, she told the Sigillite. And I will begin work immediately. Of course. Malkador replied, unable to completely hide his relief. From her, at least. The Pan-Pacific Empire has also revealed several new Nergalite bioweapons, and while our data on them is limited, we still need whatever counters we can get, if you would prioritize that. Certainly. I will leave you to it, then. Malkador said, rising to his feet. I have much work to tend to, though if any complications arise, you can have the custodians alert me. I will. Isha assured him, watching him go. She privately wondered what Malkador's own thoughts on the current crisis were. He seemed calm, but he too had watched his civilization crumble and burn because chaos had corrupted mankind's most powerful creations. But he kept most of his emotions locked behind his psychic shields, and even she could only sense the very surface. Penetrating them was well within her ability, but would be both cruel and foolish. Sighing, Isha crossed her arms. Nothing to do but wait for Astarte to arrive. Fortunately, she did not have to wait long, for Astarte appeared scarce minutes after Malkador left, immediately offering Isha a data slate. How goes the work, Astarte? Isha asked, even as she scrolled through the information on the data slate. Well, for the most part, with only a few minor difficulties. Astarte replied. The mortal looked even older and more hollow than she had when Isha had first met her. Her head was almost completely hairless now, her skin had turned grey and become even more wrinkled, and she now wore a sheer, floor-length white shift, all of which had combined to make her look like an almost transparent wraith rather than a living mortal. Most puzzlingly, Astarte had encouraged this appearance. Even as she ensured that on the inside, she remained in flawless condition, she had deliberately encouraged the decay of her exterior. Isha did not pretend to understand why Astarte felt it necessary to go to such great lengths to make herself look so frail and aged, but it was not her place to ask. She and Astarte were colleagues of a sort, and Isha had managed to temper Astarte's fear of her over the past few years. It wasn't truly gone, and she doubted it ever would be, but at least Astarte was no longer filled with dread at the mere sight of her. But they were not friends. No one in the Imperium was Isha's friend. So I see, Isha said in response to the gene right, looking through the files and making mental notes on how to counter the various bioweapons. The Plague Father's worshippers had clearly been hard at work coming up with new horrors. One weapon, labeled as GD4 by the Imperium, was designed to leave any of those who were infected in a constant cycle of rot and regeneration, except that the regeneration would be wrong and leave the infected twisted. Another was designed to animate the corpses of the dead, a third to transform even plants and insects into monsters who could spread Nurgle's decay. But it wasn't the effects, but the genetic code of these new bioweapons that were truly twisted and complicated, and reeked of direct demonic knowledge and influence to her. Nurgle must be getting frustrated with the work she had done to counter his, and nearly stamped out all disease in the Imperium besides. It was a thought Isha took no small pride in. And unfortunately for Nurgle, she was still easily capable of countering every new weapon his cults devised. Diminished or not, she was still a goddess, and being incarnate in the Materium had its advantages. Nurgle, though stronger than her for now, could not influence or empower the creations of his followers to the same degree. Lady Isha. Astarte interrupted her thoughts. Yes. Isha said, looking at her. What is it? I had a request to make of you. Astarte said slowly, nervous but clearly determined. For some time now, I have believed that the Emperor's plan to replace the Thunder Warriors with Space Marines is a mistake. I have found several worrying factors in the genocide used to create the latter, not to mention the genetic loyalty they have to their primarchs. And we have no idea what condition the primarchs will be in even if we find them all, or what they might think of the Emperor. Isha could guess where Astarte was going with this. And you want my help in convincing the Emperor he should, at the very least, not replace the Thunder Warriors completely, I take it. Astarte nodded. I do. Ideally, I would prefer to simply put an end to the Space Marine program entirely, but I know the Emperor will never agree to that. Isha considered the request. Astarte made a valid point. The ingrained genetic loyalty to the Emperor's sons could be troublesome depending on what exactly had happened to all the children. Horus was stable and lacked any traces of the influence of chaos, but that guaranteed nothing about the condition of the other children. Having studied and contributed to the designs for the Space Marines, Isha was certain that the vast majority of any legion would likely follow their primarch if the primarch spent any modicum of time with them. The primarch would not even necessarily have to reciprocate the instinctive attachment the legion would have to them, that was just how the gene seed worked. Keeping the primarchs away from their legions and only introducing them after it had been made certain the primarch was stable would reduce chances of trouble, but not erase it. The Thunder Warriors lacked that sort of problem. And if new ones were made, they would be even more loyal and stable than their predecessors, never having to deal with the same sort of madness and ill health as the original Thunder Warriors. But, would the Emperor listen if Isha raised the idea to him? He had invested much effort in the Space Marines, perhaps too much to discard them now. More than that, he might think she was trying to promote the gene-engineered warriors whose design she had the most influence over his own creations. Perhaps even come to the conclusion that she had, in fact, planted some secret contingency in the Thunder Warriors. I will consider it, she told Astarte finally. This was not something she could be hasty about. Do you have any other data to support this conclusion? I do. I have been working on it for quite some time and my efforts finally bore fruit in the last few days, while you were gone. Several of the legions seem to have a buried tendency towards mutation, one which has not emerged yet but nor have I been able to remove it. I would not even have noticed if not for what I have learned from your work over the past few years. It was exceptionally well hidden. The 15th Legion, for example, seems to have the most concerning tendency. The information is there on the data slate. Isha frowned, flicking through the data on the new bioweapons to the files about the 15th Legion. As Astarte said, the hidden tendency towards mutation was there in the genetic code, and very well hidden. The work of chaos, no doubt. Those parasites could be infuriatingly subtle when they bothered. So they did have designs on both the primarchs and their legions. Isha had expected as much, but this was confirmation. She was going to have to discuss this with the Emperor, she realized. Even if he was unwilling to agree to Astarte's proposal, he needed to know. I will talk to the Emperor about this when he returns. Isha told the mortal Gene right. In the meantime, I will also see what I can come up with to correct the flaws in the genocide. It would be easier to fix if she had direct access to it, but that wasn't possible for now. Thank you. Astarte, visibly relieved. Isha nodded briskly. Now, let us get back to the work at hand. Check the description for the links to the author.